Ready.
Okay, guys.
Spaghetti. Hi.
Hi, here we are finally for a very anticipated interview. Today we're going to be talking with Michele Colón, who is one of the frontline fighters, the defenders of people who are coming out of the WMSCOG. And she is the author and co creator of the infamous website examining the WMSCOG. And we've referenced it several times. I mean, in almost every single podcast. And it's been instrumental in getting out information. As we've talked about, the church controls information so much. And Michele has been just working really hard to get out all the information so everybody can have equal access. So, anyway, so here we are. And thank you, Michele, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
Hi.
Yeah.
We're so excited. So today we're going to start with just Michele kind of sharing her story of her time before the church, the time in the church, and kind of how that all evolved for her. So take it away, girl. If you want to can you explain to us kind of what you were doing before you were introduced into the church and then how that kind of was presented to you and how you got into it?
Yeah, so I was this was back in 2009. I was working in a medical practice, and two of the girls I worked with at the time invited me to the church. They had asked me a couple times about it. And one night I finally agreed to go. So I asked them, if that night would be a good time, and that's how I did my first Bible study there. And I got baptized the first day.
Wow.
Yeah, so there was a lot of pressure to get baptized right away. And I think that my defenses were down because, the girls were sort of my friends at that point.
Mm-hmm.
We'd worked together, not for a long time, but, we just sort of clicked when we met. And um, yeah, they seemed happy in the church. So I guess I wasn't, too concerned at that point.
Did you
Um,
go to a church before that? Like, were you religious or were you just kind of?
So I was raised Catholic as a little girl, and then went to like a Christian church when I was a teenager. Like we did that teenager Bible group thing um, at a Baptist church. But I wasn't overly religious. Like I wouldn't go to church every Sunday or anything. Like I'd go with my mom sometimes, but
Cool. So you had
yeah,
like the basic belief of like Christianity, Catholicism.
right.
Yeah,
hmm
cool.
Um, I think that my father having passed away at the end of 2007 made me more vulnerable at that point.
Mm.
Um, Yeah, and also I was dating uh, the person who would later become my husband at the time, and we were having a little bit of a rocky time, and I wasn't really sure why, but that also, I guess, made me, want to, I guess, seek comfort somewhere.
Yeah.
Uh, so that's how it all started.
How long were you guys dating before the church?
About a year.
A year before.
Mhm.
So interesting. Okay, so then you get baptized like day one,
Yep.
and then are you just like this is amazing, or were you like this is kind of weird now that I'm in it, like now that I'm here?
The first day, the study about the Sabbath, I was impressed by it for some reason. I was a bit of a conspiracy theorist back then, I think. Um so yeah, so the Sabbath thing, it seemed like it makes sense, but I didn't have a lot of knowledge about the Bible, even though I had been to church, over the years. So I think that also made me vulnerable because as they skipped around, I didn't really have any like basis to, you know, go off of. So I sort of believed whatever they told me. But I did find that the skipping around thing was a little bit weird. But initially, I guess when you don't really think about it, it did sort of make sense.
Yeah, and
Um,
unless you've gone to school and like know the Bible back to front, like you don't really
yeah,
you wouldn't really know like, hey, wait a second, that's kind of taken out of context.
Well,
Or
they have a Bible verse to say why they skip around. So like
Right.
everything they do, they have a justification. So you're like, okay, that makes sense. Why would you lie to me? Of course you're a pastor. Why would you lie?
yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so you were like trusting them and
Right. And also like one thing I liked about the church in the beginning, was that there were a lot of like younger people. And most of the other churches I'd been to were like, there were a lot of much older people or like youth group, like not, no one sort of in between. Um, so I did like that a lot about that location. There were a lot of people my age, a lot of people who were also Hispanic as well. Yeah.
and
So
this was a big main church that you were baptized into?
yeah, I was baptized at Ridgewood.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's a bigger location up here in New Jersey. So
And
So,
so
so how long in until, because this would have been like during did your church preach about the like 2012 doomsday?
so I didn't find out about that until things became stressed between my husband and I. Like I didn't find out about that until I was already there for a while. So
Oh, okay. So you had already gotten married by this point.
yeah, not to skip ahead, but
Oh,
yeah.
no,
Mhm.
that's okay. So we'll go back to that because
Yeah.
I'm curious how that's always like revealed to you guys, because that's like normal. Oh shit, the world's gonna end. Like that's got to be like so shocking when you find that out about
I
that.
do remember one of the two girls that recruited me. We were in like in a group setting. I think it was in between services on a Saturday, and one of them was talking about how she wanted to go to nursing school and how she was gonna go to a 2-year program. And this is back in now 2009, the end of 2009, early 2010 maybe, the latest. And so the one of the other like the sisters asked her, oh well, how long would that take for you to graduate? And she's like, 2 years if I go full time. And she's like, oh girl, don't even waste your time. Like we're not going to be here, at that point. And I'm like, wait, what? I remember hearing that and going, wait, what? But they didn't elaborate. When I tried to ask about it, they were like, oh, you just keep studying. That's, what I was told most of the time whenever I had a question was just keep studying and all of my questions would be answered. Yeah.
Mm.
Wow. And
So
did
when
you?
you were baptized, they weren't like, oh, the world's coming and ending in 2012. But the
No,
other members had already had an understanding of that kind of
it
probably.
seemed like it. Yeah.
Right,
There were
right,
little comments that were made like that made me kind of like, raise an eyebrow, like, wait, what?
right. But they
But when
wouldn't want to tell you that right away. Right,
no, no,
right.
not at all.
Interesting. So in the beginning, you really felt like, all right, I don't know everything, but I gotta like slowly wait for the info, and you were kind of into it. Like it wasn't just you.
Yeah, I found it comforting that there were people my age, the people like I could relate to, and everyone seemed really happy. Uh,
Mm,
yeah, I now looking back, I understand that it was a lot of love bombing, and the longer I spent there, the more I realized that people weren't that happy.
yeah, yeah.
So, in the beginning, not going as often as I would later in my membership there, I didn't get to see all of that. Um, you know,
So when you went to get baptized, was your boyfriend with you, or did he come later?
no, so I invited him. It was like 2 weeks after I
Okay,
joined.
okay. So he after you were like, I'm already baptized. We're doing this.
Yeah. Yeah, when I first spoke to him about the church, mind you, I joined in the end of October. So 2 weeks later would have been like beginning to middle of November. And I remember him saying to me, he's like, I'll go to the church with you, but I'm going to tell you right now, like like the holidays were really important to him to spend with his family. He's like, I don't care what they say. I'm not going to not spend the holidays with my family. And I'm like, in my mind, I'm like, okay, just go and see what they have to say. But at this point, I had already seen the video that they show you about how evil Christmas is and all that. um, so I was like, oh, like when he said that, it kind of gave me like a weird feeling. Like I felt like, oh, he doesn't know what he's in for yet, kind of thing. But I didn't want to say anything because I felt like if I said something to him, he would change his mind and not go. And at that point, I was happy there, so I wanted him to join because I thought that he would like it as well. So we met dancing. So I took lessons for years, and we ended up on a dance team together, and we ended up being partners, and that's how we ended up dating. And
What kind of dancing? Salsa dancing?
yeah, salsa, just to give you
Wow.
a
Oh,
about
fun.
how we met and stuff. So yeah, so we've been dating about a year when we both joined. My
Was
son
he
was also,
baptized right away?
yeah, my son, who was a teenager at the time, also went and was baptized along with him. Um, yeah, so everything was kind of great in the beginning, honestly.
That explanation of how you didn't tell him all of the
Hmm.
details you knew, really perfect explanation of how they get people to join. Because
Yeah,
it's like you knew that something would be off-putting to him without him having like seeing the video or like having a little bit of belief before you gave him the next kind of intense information. That's just like such a perfect description of how they're able to like bring people in.
well, yeah, and I mean, they also tell you not to like tell people that much about the church. Like as far as the studies, like when you first join, they're like, don't try to tell people like what you learn later, because we teach it in order so that people understand things correctly. And sometimes when you skip ahead, like that can turn people off to the church. So they already tell you this sort of in the beginning. So that was probably why I didn't say anything.
Yeah, they
That's
do. They prepare you to say,
Yeah,
oh, don't go and tell your family that, that this is what you believe. Exactly. You need to bring them in so that we can teach them.
exactly. That
Yeah.
was their
Yeah.
big push, was like, just bring them here and we'll take care of the rest.
So he came and he enjoyed it, huh? And he got baptized.
Yeah, so yeah, in the beginning everything was fine. So we all went, but I only got to study that first time with him, the time that I brought him. I didn't get to study with my son again either after that. So that was uncomfortable for me. Even the girls that I joined with that recruited me, I never studied again with them either. Um, so I found that to be odd that, you know, once I was in, then now I was kind of separated from them.
is that something that they normally do? I mean, is that something that Tony that you've ever heard of before?
Yeah. So like if so she would probably, were you assigned like a Bible teacher that would like teach you consistently or?
Yeah, initially it was Raymond's wife, Lauren.
Oh, that's hilarious.
Yeah, I'm laughing because I later found out that she asked me to like be reassigned to somebody else because like I think I was a little too intense for her and I asked like too many questions.
Yeah.
And she's very like mild-mannered and everything. So I think that yeah, just wasn't a good fit for her perhaps. So
But
they are
honestly, that would happen. That would happen where like they would change Bible teachers according to different personalities.
yeah, to put you with somebody who you maybe relate to better or
Right.
who you perhaps might have something in common with. Like I mean that
Right.
makes sense to do that.
So first you were studying with Raymond's wife, and then after that, who did you study with?
Paula. Paula.
Okay.
Yeah, she's another deaconess.
So how long were you in it where you were like really enjoying it? What was the time frame like?
So just to go back like a little bit. So
Mm-hmm.
me and my ex-husband Mark, I'll say his name is Mark. Um, we were having like an issue in our relationship, and I found out that he was like having an affair on New Year's Eve. So I joined late October. He was there early November, and then December 31st, literally that night was when I found out. And so I immediately like panicked. I wasn't expecting that at all because at this point our relationship seemed better because we were going together um, to the church. But so I don't know, I didn't know what to do. So I told him, I said, I think we should go talk to the pastor about it, thinking that he would give us some sort of guidance on what to do. So I did meet with Pastor Lee, Daniel Lee. So he's the main pastor up in New Jersey, or he was at the time. Um, and so we went in and we talked to him, and he said a couple things that were strange. Also, his wife was in the room, and they were speaking Korean to each other sometimes, and then he'd speak to us in English. So it was a little odd because we didn't know what they were saying all the time.
Mhm.
Um, But he was like basically saying, well, if you're gonna be together, then you should be together and not with other people. Um, And then he asked Mark to leave the room, and he only spoke to me by myself for a while. His wife was still there. And he kept asking me, well, can you live without him? Right? Which seems kind of like, well, obviously I'm not going to die, right? So like physically, at that point.
Yeah.
And looking back then, I realized that that's not what he was asking me. He was asking
Mm.
me, can you live without him? Meaning, like, is this going to cause you to lose your salvation?
Mm.
Because, if I left the church because of whatever happened between he and I, or basically telling me without saying it to put my faith in God first. But it totally was not clicking in my head at the moment. I was too new, and distraught at that moment, because of everything that was happening. So after that, we stayed together, and um, a few months later, 4 months later, we were engaged. And I remember when I got the marriage certificate, like, we applied for the marriage license, I'm sorry. And I told the pastor about it because, obviously we wanted him to officiate the wedding. His question to me was, well, who told you how to do that? And, and me being as naive as I was at the time still, I'm like, what do you mean? I just Googled it, pastor. Like, I looked, I looked up how to get the marriage license and, like, followed the instructions, and, here it is. And so we ended up setting a date. So we had a date for a wedding in September. And it's funny, my mom still to this day doesn't even know this. Like, I haven't shared this with my family or anybody. But so the pastor married us in his office in May, which was 4 months before the actual wedding. And nobody in my family or his family knew about it. The pastor told us not to tell.
Wow.
Not to tell anybody. Because then they would think negatively about the church. So we had to keep that a secret. Um, yeah, so then we would, everything was fine. And then we got married in September. We had the wedding. And right before that, again, me being naive as I was still about what was really going on, like, little things happened that were sort of like red flags that I filed away. But I remember telling the deaconess that we were going on our honeymoon and the dates that we would be gone. So we would miss, I think, a Tuesday and a Saturday because our honeymoon was like 7 or 8 days. And she's like, oh, did you ask the pastor like what you should be doing during that time? And I'm like, no. But she was sort of suggesting to me, like, if I had asked permission to take a honeymoon. But still, again, it wasn't really clicking in my head because, I not surprisingly, I was the little bit of the rebellious type. I still am. So, that stuff didn't really affect me as much in the beginning because I just kind of like, well, I already booked it. I have my tickets. Like, what do you mean ask permission? Like, that to me, it was too late already. So,
Yeah, you're like, I'm going on a honeymoon. What the
I
hell are you
think
talking about?
I think
right.
it's interesting too that that wasn't working on you because you were in your 30s at that point. You were 30. And
Yeah.
most of the new members were like in their early 20s. And so for you, you're like, I'm a grown ass lady. Like, I'm a grown ass adult already. So like I Googled how to find my marriage certificate. What are you talking about? I pay my own mortgage. Like I'm a grown ass adult. Like, I know how to already do this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So I bet there's an element of just like you were already like an adult, you know?
Yeah, that's probably too what it was. Yeah, because it wasn't really cooking for me that I had to ask permission for everything at that time. So, Mark ended up talking to the pastor about what we were supposed to do while we were over there. We were supposed to read, and I remember having my sheep listen to my voice book over there, and we were supposed to pray at the normal prayer times. And even though we were over there, we were still in touch with our handlers, what I call them, um, even on our honeymoon. Um, so we had a good time. We finally got to rest. I remember being so exhausted by that point because we've been planning a wedding. We bought a house that was a foreclosure that needed a lot of work. So between like the construction and like our full-time jobs and then going to the church, and then we also were still dancing. Um, Not as often, but in my ex-husband was learning to teach dance lessons. And So that was taking up a lot of his time as well. So like something had to give. So we were just really tired, and we actually got to sleep over there. Um, and so when we got back from the honeymoon, was when things sort of got much more intense and weird. The pressure to spend more time at the church was like intense at that point. Um, so I felt a little bit suffocated at that point. Like it was just too much, you
Like,
know?
were they trying to train you guys to become leaders? Did they expect more time, more money,
It
more?
was right. So it was more time for sure. I was like, the text about "Are you coming today?" was like every day, and then when I was there on Saturday, it's like, "Are you coming tomorrow?" And initially we weren't doing that. We spent Sundays together as a couple, and so um, that all changed also. And they sort of made you feel guilty, like if you said you weren't coming back because you had, something to do. They would be like, "Oh," like like they'd seem sad or something. It was very weird.
It seems like maybe after you guys got married, they expected you guys maybe to be like a gospel worker couple. Did you feel like maybe a little bit of pressure like that?
Yeah, and also, they came to help us one day with the house, painting and stuff, and then they also did help with the wedding. So it felt like to me as though when we got back, it was like we owed them.
Hmm.
It felt like we were indebted to them now. And so the pressure was really like heavy at that point, which made me very uncomfortable. Um, yeah, and I don't know why, for Mark it was different for him. He just kind of did it as he was told, I think, and didn't really ask any questions, it seemed like. Where I was the one that was more like, wait, something's off here. So like little things started to happen that caused me to start to look around and really ask questions and say, okay, what's going on here? So I started to notice that um at first I'm like, I have no idea who's married here and who isn't, because the women and the men are completely separate, and it's like you really aren't supposed to make eye contact with somebody of the opposite sex here. And I noticed that like no one was having kids, even though there was like a kids room. And then another girl that I sat next to sometimes, because that was another thing, that the seating arrangements, they were assigned. Like you couldn't just go into a service and sit anywhere. You had to sit where they told you to sit. So that started to kind of, raise questions for me. Um, so I remember, her husband was in the choir and everything. And then one day I was sitting next to her and she didn't have her wedding rings on. And I just happened to ask her, like, hey, what happened to your wedding ring? And she's like, oh, I lost them, which didn't make any sense, And something seemed off about her, and I couldn't figure out what it was. And then, I later found out that her and her husband separated for whatever reason. Um, but yeah, it was weird. Um, it seemed like the people who were married kind of kept it secret, and then and then everybody else. So I remember asking the deaconess that was with me most of the time. I was like, so if you're not supposed to like talk to people of the opposite sex, and you don't sit with them to study, you really don't have much interaction with them, like how do people get married here? Because I came already, in a relationship with somebody. And she said, oh well, if you like somebody, then you would ask the pastor to try to see if he thinks it's a good match for you, and then like he would arrange, like for you guys to date if he approved. And that was a big red flag for me. I
So
was like,
you
wait.
found that out. You found that out a year later, like after you had
Yeah.
married. That's crazy.
Yeah, and I didn't even know who Zhang Gilja was until I was there for 6 months.
Wow.
Oh,
Because yeah, up until then they were like mother, 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 but to me it was like this sort of abstract sort of concept. They would mention An Sang Hong's name but not hers, right? So until I finally did the study about her and they told me that she was like alive, I eventually, what is this woman's name? Why don't they ever say her name? They always say An Sang Hong's name, but they don't ever say hers. So I
Hmm.
remember she wrote her name in my notebook, where I had like my Bible study notes and stuff. So yeah, I didn't find out her name until I was there for 6 months already, which was before I got married. So yeah, so I started asking a lot of questions. I remember I even went into the pastor's office one time and asked him directly. I said, why is it that, the couples here, like nobody's really having kids? And his answer was, well, he's like, there's nothing wrong with having kids. I have kids, but of course his kids were grown-ups already. Um, but he was saying, the gospel working couples, like if they have babies, that will hinder the gospel work because then they would have to take care of the babies and, worry about the babies. And then it would, hinder them from preaching and all this other stuff. So I was like, okay. And when I had mentioned to Paula that I had planned to have kids with Mark after we got married, she was like, what? Why would you want to have kids? And I'm like, what do you mean? Why would I want to have kids? And then she showed me the verse in the Bible about in the end times that something about the moms weren't going to have food for the babies or something. I don't remember exactly which verse it was, but it was just really scary. I remember that verse and the way it was written. And I was just like, okay. So it's all started to kind of come together slowly.
Tony just told me about that Bible verse, I think, on our last one, about the moms eating the babies because they run out of food.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, that would be terrifying. If you like truly believe that's going to happen, it would make you not want to have a baby. That's awful.
Yeah. Right. And so then I remember one of the deaconesses telling me, it's like, yeah, we know the date the world's going to end. And I'm like, well, what date is that? She's like, you just have to keep studying. And I'm just like, why is that always the answer? But like, I don't ever get the answer during the Bible studies. Like that started to frustrate me after a while. Like that was only going to work for, a certain amount of time. And then one of the other things that happened, I remember, was when we did the tithing study. So after that, I was expected to tithe, 10% of my income. And when we were saving up for a house, I couldn't. I needed the money for the down payment on the house. So I was giving what I could, but it wasn't, 10%. So the amount that I was donating decreased. And they obviously noticed because they made me do the tithes and offering study again. Right. And I'm like, I had my little list of Bible studies and I'm checking them off as I go along. And I'm like, wait, I did that one already. And Paula was like, yeah, but sometimes we do the studies twice, even those of us that have been here for a while, because you might miss certain things the first time around. And I was just like, okay. So this one was done by the pastor in the sanctuary, which I thought was odd. So I was like, okay. And I remember him saying, it's like, oh, well, you think anybody in the church gets paid? Nobody in the church gets paid a salary. Everybody in the church has a job and all this other stuff. And he pointed to a sister who supposedly worked for a bank and was like, if there was basically saying like if there was something weird going on with the money that like she would somehow know, which to me made no sense because I'm like, she works for a bank. She doesn't work for the church. So to me, I'm like, I don't see the connection, but okay. I always sometimes would give him the benefit of the doubt that it was like a language barrier, that perhaps he wasn't communicating what he wanted to say, or I wasn't understanding what he was trying to communicate because of that. So yeah, it was
because he's Korean, right? He's a Korean pastor.
So
right?
His accent is very, very heavy. So
right.
And I remember in the beginning making a comment about that to Paula. I was like, it's so funny how like when I first started here, I could not understand the lick of what this man was saying, and now I can sort of like kind of get it. And she's like, yeah, it's so spiritual that you start to understand the pastor after you've been here and you start to believe. And I'm like, what? So it the fact that they try to attach a spiritual meaning to the most like very little things started to bother me a little bit, because to me it was really like unnecessarily dramatic.
Yeah, they're adding magic to everything that's not magical, and you're like, wait a second. If every little thing that isn't magical, then what about the big things that feel magical?
Exactly. I mean, even I remember one of the sisters was like, oh, everybody here is so young and everybody looks so young and we all have really long eyelashes. And she was trying to tie that to our membership to the church. It was really bizarre. And I was like, okay.
Before you joined the church, did you ever take any like psychology classes, or had you ever been like interested in cults, like to help you have these kind of awareness that these are red flags?
So I was a psych nurse for years.
Oh.
And even when I wasn't in psych specifically, I still worked in psych ERs in
Hmm.
the earlier part of my career. And I also taught psych nursing for a semester at the community college near me. So um, I was aware of, I think, a little bit more because of that. So
Well, that's
yeah,
fascinating. So a lot of these things you probably had seen before.
yeah, yeah. I even questioned at one point. I remember thinking to myself that I was always really tired before I went to the church. But when I got there and like the services started and the singing started, it was almost like um it would create like this sense of like energy, right? And I remember seeing people like kind of like fired up for lack of a better way to put it, like after the services, like I'm gonna go preach now and all this
Like a
stuff.
like on a drug almost.
Exactly. And to me, it's, I would say to myself, this seems like a cult induced mania type of thing, where it's like a group, like everybody as a group is like now hyped up together. And not for any particular reason, it seemed like, like a pep rally almost, right? You get everybody excited for the game and all this other stuff. So that it's that I did notice that. Um, and I noticed a pattern of that, which was odd, and it was an odd feeling for me to experience that energy sort of rub off on me that way. Yeah.
As all of this stuff is kind of coming up for you, are you like going home and talking with your husband about it, or are you kind of like keeping it to yourself, or are you kind of talking with Paula about it? Like,
To myself, right? Because expressing any sort of doubts or negative feelings about the church was very highly discouraged. Um, and it's hard to know who to trust there because I did notice that anything I did discuss with Paula sort of came back around, or things that I would discuss with my husband would sort of come back around. So, um, I got the sense that there wasn't a lot of privacy about whatever I would discuss, whether it be with Paula or with Mark. So that kind of made me a little apprehensive to express any of the other things that were kind of going on in my head. Um,
and what
but
about your son? Was he like feeling the same way as you, or was he like in it?
So he was into it, but I wasn't so strict with him about making him go as much. Like he was doing sports on the weekends and stuff, and I wouldn't make him miss like his events to go to the church. Um, I remember the first time that he participated in a fast, he was miserable. Like,
Hmm.
for people who don't know, like no food and no water there. So he did not like that. I don't remember what feast it was or what holiday, but I remember that the end of the fast was like in the middle of the afternoon, like after whatever service it was, around 3 or 4 in the afternoon. And I remember him telling me, "I'm starving. Let's get out of here." like he was becoming hangry at that point, and he wanted to get out.
Yeah.
Um, so when I did start having doubts about the church, I didn't want him to go. And at first he was a little bit confused about it. So I did tell him, I said, look, I'm having a little bit of doubts about the church. I'm not so sure. Let me figure this out. And, if everything's okay, then you can start coming back. But until then, I don't want you going back. So I just, you know, I didn't take him with me for a while after that. So yeah, so after the honeymoon, I started to feel really uncomfortable because these things are sort of adding up, right? Like the pressure to spend more and more time there, and then the pressure to give more money. Um, and the way that I remember there was one service that I was sitting through it. I saw this girl like a couple rows behind me who was just bawling, like crying the entire time. And I noticed that she was pregnant, right? And I said to Paul, I was like, why is that girl crying? Like I felt bad for her. I'm like, wow, she looks like she's like really upset. And she's like, well, she's sad because she made a mistake and she got pregnant. And I was just like, okay. That made me feel like not good. I had my son when I was very young. So that sort of like judgmental thing about women having kids earlier, whenever they feel like having them, is like a sensitive area for me. I think that's a woman's decision, shouldn't be anybody else's decision, not the church's decision, not their parents' decision, like, So that sort of rubbed me the wrong way, I remember. And I remember another time that I went to the church, there was this girl who was just crying outside on the bench, like bawling. And I'm like, what is going on here? Why is it that, like, people seem so happy in the beginning, but now I see, like, every now and again, somebody's really super upset, and publicly super upset. Like, they're not even trying to hide it. It would just seem very odd, and um, it made me really uncomfortable. So, yeah, so I eventually started looking things up. I know one of my friends who danced with us, she was very Christian. And when she heard about the church, she had sent me some information because I told her about the Sabbath thing and, about Constantine and that not really happening, and, about why Christians worship on Sunday. And so wanting to prove, like, that my beliefs were correct, right? I'm like looking online and trying to find, like, historical evidence that would support what the church taught me so that I could respond to her and, like, sort of defend my beliefs at that time. So that was my intention initially, was to defend my beliefs, right? And in that process, I found that a lot of the things that I was taught by the WMS were not correct, like about Constantine abolishing the Sabbath. So, there's one thing, like, if you teach interpretations of the Bible, right, you can disagree on that. But then there are historical facts. So at that point, that really started to bother me, because I'm like, you can't be God's church and, or have God at the head of your church, who should be perfect according to the Bible, and there are no mistakes and there's no room for error. How is it that, like, these historical facts are not correct? So that's kind of started everything for me. Everything started sort of falling apart. So then the more I looked things up online, the more I found inconsistencies. And then I found some like old forums that seemed not to be running at the time. And there were a couple of stories from people who had joined and left for various reasons. And I remember reading a story about someone whose relationship was ruined by the church, and someone else who had a child who developed pneumonia and didn't take the child to the hospital because it was a Sabbath, and that was Satan trying to use the child to keep them from keeping the Sabbath. And I remember even when I was in the church, I heard a fragrance, which is a public confession, basically. They'd make people go up there and, tell some sort of story about how their faith was tested and, how they overcame it or whatever. And this brother was up there saying about how his baby had a fever and how he felt so guilty because he knew that that was Satan trying to keep him from celebrating the Sabbath, and that he felt guilty that he had to stay home and take care of his baby. So that really bothered me also.
Had you read the thing online about the pneumonia by then, or was that before? And then you read the pneumonia thing and you're like, oh, okay.
I don't remember what order it was in,
Yeah.
but it was equally disturbing when I read it
Right.
and I heard it, and I'm
Right.
just like, this
Like
isn't
reading
right.
it online and then hearing it in the church, you're like, oh shit, this is actually
Yeah.
on. This isn't.
Yeah. So that really bothered me. And at that point, I remember I didn't feel comfortable asking questions, like, in the church that much, not about stuff like that. So the more I read, the more I found, and then I couldn't keep it quiet anymore. I wanted to tell my husband, who at that time was in the middle of a 3-day fast. And I chose not to participate in the fast because I remember when they were explaining it to us in my individual group, they were, saying no food, no water from this time to that time and stuff like that. And there was a sister in the group who was like, well, what do I do with my baby? Her baby was, I believe, like 18 months old at the time. And the deaconess told her, well, your baby needs salvation too. Basically telling her, like, yeah, well, this is how it is, and she's like, don't worry, like, they keep the kids distracted, and all this other stuff. So she wasn't even going to be with her kid, who she was not going to feed or give anything to drink. And so that bothered me. And I'm like, I'm not doing it. Like, there's just no way. But he was participating in it. And so one day when I found all that stuff online, I sent him a message. I'm like, look, I need to talk to you, like, as soon as we get home. And when we both got home from work, I showed him everything that I found, and like he was really upset by it. He's like, oh my God, like I can't believe that they're doing this to people. Like I feel so lost now. I can't believe that I was fooled, you know? So we went out to dinner. It was a Tuesday. I won't forget that because we were supposed to go to service that night. And so during dinner, that's all we talked about how crazy it was that they were able to kind of fool us and deceive us. And he just kept saying about how lost he felt. I didn't feel that at that time, you know, because I'm like, I just, you know, if this is the truth that we were fooled, then okay, we'll just move on from it, you know. But he felt very, very lost at that time. And he's like, you know, now I don't know what to do. So we chose not to go that night. And as soon as the service was over, we both got text messages from our handlers like, oh, where were you guys? And this and that. And why didn't you make it to church? And so we both said that we wouldn't be coming back, that we'd read some stuff online that we weren't comfortable with. And that was that. And then they convinced us to go and meet with the pastor to ask whatever questions that we had. They're like, you know, sometimes people talk badly about us on the internet, but you know, just come to the church and we'll answer any questions that you have. And you know, they reassured us. So we go, and at this point I'm like prepared with like all the questions that I have about the studies, the parts that didn't make sense, and other issues that I had, and I just kind of put them all out on the table. And when we got there, it was the pastor. I remember Raymond was in the room. Paula was in the room. Victor Lozada was in the room. He's now like a missionary and elder or something. I can't remember who else, but definitely the three of them I remember were there. Mark and the pastor.
I was going to say what your husband was with you too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But he wasn't really asking questions. He was very quiet most of the time. So I think they quickly figured out that I was the one that was really having the doubts, and that he was kind of struggling, like internally about it. And, you know, I had the attitude of like, well, you know, if it's that people are spreading lies on the internet about the church and they're not true, then we need to do something about it, right? Like if they answered my questions and they were able to, you know, put my concerns at ease, then, you know, I would have then done whatever I had to do to sort of remedy the situation and defend them. Like I was like literally ready to like defend my beliefs. I remember Mark telling me that night when we got home, he's like, you know, that's awesome that like, you know, you're saying that if people are telling lies about the church, that like, then we need to do something about it. Like he was happy that I had said that, and he was all supportive of that part. But one of the things that the pastor like tried to explain to me rubbed me the wrong way, and it had to do with like a translation from Korean to English. I won't get into too much detail about that. Like it's in my 5-part story if anybody's interested in exactly what that was. But I ended up finding out that what he told me about the translation was a lie. And that really, really bothered me. So he told me that the word meant one thing and the word meant something else, right? And that to me was kind of like the straw, because I'm like, wait, like I trusted you. I was willing to listen to you and, you know, give you the benefit of the doubt and everything. But now like you just flat out lied. So at that point,
Can I just say really quick? So Michelle, because I think it's really funny. You know, she asked the pastor what this word means in Korean, and he told her one word. And then she went and she found like somebody Korean outside of the church and said, hey, what does this translation mean? And that was how she found out that the pastor had lied. So like that must have been really surprising, because you would never expect that the pastor would lie about, you know, the translation of a very important book that we use, right?
Right. Exactly.
And that just shows how much they really like assume that you guys are not going to question anything they say. Like, why would they think that you wouldn't go? I mean, the fact that he was like, I'm just going to lie to you about this because it's in Korean. There's no way she'll find out. And you're like, let me step out onto the street here and find a Korean.
Right. And exactly literally what I did. Like, I asked my husband to take me to a nearby town where a lot of Korean people live. And I'm like, I'm just going to keep randomly asking people in the street what this word means until, like, they tell me what the word means. And so I did that. And I actually, like, a lot of people didn't want to talk to me because they thought I was trying to recruit them.
Yeah.
I guess they had heard about the church. And so finally was like, look, I'm not trying to recruit you. I just need help with this Korean word. Like, if you could just tell me what this word means in English, that's all I need to know. So I finally did find some people that were willing to tell me what the word meant. And so
That's awesome. I'm so glad that you did that, that you actually went out to look for it yourself, because a lot of us, we just assumed, that they were just telling us the truth.
And you
Right.
mentioned your 5-part story. So while we're talking about it, because we do want to mention that Michele has written out this whole 5-part story of kind of how this all happened on the examining site. So we'll definitely put a link to that at the end of this episode, so that if you guys want to read this in more detail, I'm sure there's stuff that's in there that we'll probably just forget to cover on this.
Yeah.
Then in response to that, her now ex-husband did a 5-part response on his end. And I got it confused when she told me to go read it. I accidentally thought that he had only written one instead of Michele. And so I started off by reading his. And I was like laughing while I was reading it because I was like, oh my gosh, this is ridiculous. And then I realized it was like it was in response to yours.
Yeah,
right?
it was like a rebuttal. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So there's 2 of them. One is on the church's website. And I don't know if is it still out there?
Well, it's not, it's not an official church website, but it is a website that Victor Lozada runs. And there are a lot of inconsistencies in the story that lead me to believe that my ex-husband did not write that 5-part story, that he may have given part of the story, but a lot of the other things were made up.
Was there in that 5-part story of his, we could there's like a reference to salsa dancing to it.
Yeah.
I just thought that was like really interesting.
There was like a really crazy comparison to that. I know. I don't remember the exact words, but I know what you're talking about.
Like, I laughed out loud when I was reading it. I was like, this is just so painful to read. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Okay, so go back. So then you're in the meeting, and then you ask him about, so was it at that point that you realized he had lied about the word? Or
No,
not till
so
later?
I didn't notice that until later. So right after that meeting, there was a service. I believe it was
okay.
So he's like, after the meeting, he's like, yeah, don't worry about it. Ask as many questions as you want to, blah, blah, blah. Okay, cool. So we go to the service, and he does the service. And at the end of the service, he talks about how people read things online, and the people who have done all of the basic studies and then come back asking questions about what was said online, those people are stupid. But if you haven't done all the studies, then you can ask all the questions you want if you go online and you read something.
This was during the service where everybody's listening?
Literally during the service,
Oh
right after the meeting that I just left, when he told me that I could ask as many questions as I wanted and he would be there to answer them. He's now calling me stupid in front of everybody. And I'm just like, that really, really rubbed me the wrong way, because I'm like, why is that necessary? You know? So that also made me even more suspicious about his answer about the word. So I think that that's what pushed me even more to go and get like verification of what the word meant outside of the church. I was even in line for I don't know what. And I asked one of the Korean sisters, what does this word mean? Ha ha ha. Like, just like a random question. And she's like, yeah, that word means every day. And I was like, cool, that's what I thought. Yeah, he told me it meant something else. And so every Korean person that I asked after that what that word meant told me that it said every day and not, I think he said it meant during, which is not even close. And so I remember telling my husband about it. I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe the pastor lied to me about this. Like, not that just that he lied to me, but allegedly this book is written by who we believe was the second coming of Christ, who is God, right? So why is the pastor lying about what God wrote? That really bothered me, right? Because at the time, I'm still trying to figure this out. And that's why, for me, no matter what excuse he gave me, I wasn't going to be satisfied with it, because I'm like, you're distorting. Like, if you even if I didn't believe it anymore, you believe that this guy was God, that An Sang-hwan was God, and you believe that he wrote this, and you're lying to me about what he wrote. Like, they always say how like you can't add or take away from the Bible or from God's words because you receive plagues and all this other stuff. So that was something that was sort of drilled into my head before then. So to see him do that really, really bothered me. And I remember my husband not saying anything to me right away about it, but then, coming, a couple of days later or something and saying how like, well, the pastor did that to save you. And I'm like, what? I'm like, Mark, like find me an example in the Bible where Jesus or any of his disciples lied to someone else to save them. Like, or lied to someone else about what the Bible says to save them. This doesn't sound right. And I'm like, this is really bothering me. And
They got him right at his most vulnerable moment, and
yeah,
they got him to think the little tiny tweaks are to keep your salvation. Oh, man, that's so frustrating.
yeah. So at that point, I decided I wasn't going back. And I remember talking to Mark and saying to him, like, look, if this is what you want to believe, then fine, stay in the church, not a problem. I said, but just promise me one thing. I said, promise me that you won't let them separate us, like in the story that we read that somebody posted online. Because that was one of the stories that I showed him that I was like really worried about. I'm like, and I remember when I showed it to him, I was like, what would happen if like one of us stopped going? Like, would they try to separate us? I was like, that's a big deal to me. And, he promised me that he wouldn't let that happen, but obviously, that didn't last. And so I stopped going. And I I just kept looking at now I was looking at the Bible studies and I was looking at the books that I had, and I remember looking at the green book and coming across the line where it says like salvation's only found in the name of Jesus now and forever, or whatever the words are. And I'm like, wait, what? So I remember saying to Mark, I was like, Mark, what is up with this? Like, why does it say only Jesus? So I think he went back and told them that I was going through the books and now sort of questioning. So they told him to take the books from me. So one morning I was still asleep, and before he went to work, he went and took the books out of my trunk and took them back to the church without saying anything. And I remember when I went back to look for the books, I'm like, where are the books? So I asked him, like, where'd my books go? And he's like, well, you can't have those books if you're just going to use them to talk bad about the church. And I'm like, all I did was literally read to you what the book said. I didn't say anything bad about the church. What I was saying was, why does it say this, but they teach something different? It was a valid question.
Tony did that too. When her husband was coming out of it, she returned his books to the pastor.
Really? Yeah. So
Yeah, I remember her doing that. I was like, damn, Tony, you're cold-hearted.
Because we were told that those were special books because he was a house church leader. So he had certain books that other members didn't have. Michelle, what year was this that you so what year was it that you just completely stopped going?
So it was the end of 2010.
Okay.
Yeah, so we had only been married we were technically married in May. So this is the end of the same exact year. So it was maybe 6 months when I stopped
Wow.
going.
Wow.
And so had all these questions and stuff like that, and just things were getting very tense at home, because that's when I really realized that no matter what question I asked him or what kind of discussion we had, he'd come back with some response from the church. So it started to bother me that now within a marriage there was no privacy at all, right? And yeah, so things got tense, and then one day I remember his mom showed up early in the morning ringing the doorbell, and I didn't have to be at work early that day. I was scheduled to go in a little later, but he had to go at his regular time, and I'm like, what is her mom doing here so early? Like, it was so weird. He's like, I don't know, and I don't know what happened after that. And remember going to work that day, was a Friday, and I had just had this weird feeling that I could not shake all day. And I remember I had to run an errand after work, and I remember calling my mom and saying to her, like, I was like, Mom, I have a feeling something's off. Can you please drive by the house and see if you see anything? See if you see his car there or something going on. Something's not right, and he's not answering the phone. Um, So she did drive by. She's like, I don't see anything. I don't see anybody here. And I tried calling his job, and his employer was telling me he wasn't there. And I'm like, what do you mean he's not there? Because as far as I know, he went to work a few hours ago. Um, so I think that someone at his job must have called him and was like, listen, call her back because she's calling here asking for you, and like we don't know what to say anymore. I think it kind of something like that happened. Because when I did finally speak to him, he said that he moved out and that he couldn't stay with me because I wasn't going to the church anymore. And I was so upset. Like I came home and all of his stuff was gone. Like just like that. Like while I was at work. Um and I was so upset. And I just kept texting him like, how could you do this? Like, like at least come back and talk to me. So we did talk a couple of days later. And he agreed to come back only if I agreed to go to the church and go to at least one service on the Saturday, right? And I'm like, okay. Like it felt weird, but at that time I was sort of desperate, and I was really upset. And I'm like, fine, I'll go to
But he knew that you didn't believe anymore.
Yeah, he knew I didn't want to
Yeah.
go.
Yeah.
So he moved back, and I went to the one service and I hated it. And like they had me sit with him, which was weird because they literally never let us sit next to each other, and I never saw like a couple sitting next to each other ever. And I asked the deaconess, I'm like, why am I sitting next to Mark? And she's like, oh, well, married couples sit next to each other sometimes. And I'm like, no, Paula, they don't. I've never seen that, and I've been here over a year at this point. She's like, oh yeah, and I'm just like, okay. Um, and I think that was like a Tuesday or something. I ended up going on a Tuesday for whatever reason. And then I had to do the studies over again. She told me, she's like, um, this is when they were doing that spiritual hospital thing. So this is another thing that really got me going, right? It's funny now thinking about it because so they had like on the board, they had the names of everybody's like teams and who the team leaders were, and like who was on each team and all that. And then there was like a list of names at the bottom. And I remember asking Paula, like, who are those people and why are their names down there? She's like, oh, well, this is like the spiritual hospital. So the names down there, those are the people who are in the NICU. For people who are not familiar, that's the neonatal intensive care unit, where when children are born prematurely or with some sort of congenital issue or whatever, and they have not left the hospital yet after they've been born, they go to the NICU. And so I'm like, so she's like, yeah, they're in the NICU because they've stopped coming. So they're, spiritually in danger of dying. And they need extra care. And so the team leader that's assigned to taking care of them, has to check on them and try to get them to come back. And I was just like, okay. And she's like, yeah, like the team leaders are like the nurses and the pastors like the doctor. And I'm like, all right, me being a nurse, like this is sounding really ridiculous. And so that really started to kind of get me going on the inside. I'm like, I can't, this is insane. And so I remember her telling me that I had some sort of spiritual illness, and that the pastor had to do some sort of spiritual surgery, and that spiritual surgery was me doing the studies over again. But at this point, mentally, I'm not here anymore. Okay, so at that point, I did not believe anything that they said. So these things sounded even more ridiculous than they would have before that. And so
You're seeing through it all. You're just like,
yeah,
you
I
guys
remember
know,
looking at her like a spiritual surgery. Got it.
yeah. Yeah.
So, um, went for the first study with the pastor, and it was like in his office, and Mark was allowed to be in that study with me. And it was like the Bible is fact, right? It was like one of those studies that really there wasn't much substance to it, right? So we did the study, yeah, whatever. And then I remember at the end of it, I asked the pastor, tell me what, because he asked me if I had any questions. I'm like, yeah, I would like for you to tell me what the Bible says about marriage. And he would not answer, right? And he's like, oh, well, I can't get involved in your marriage and your personal problems. I said, Pastor, that's not what I'm asking you. I'm asking you what the Bible teaches about marriage. And he would not answer. And he got really frustrated and got mad at me and said, well, what difference does it make if you're both going to die? Yeah.
Like spiritually die or physically die?
Spiritually, I guess. Yeah. So I just remember that really, really got me upset because I'm like, okay, he's the pastor. Like, if you have questions about the Bible at any other church, the pastor's not going to be like, well, what difference does it make if you're going to die? Like, that's never the answer. Right. So that really, really turned me off because, they're supposed to be like the true church, right? So you would expect that their behavior be like at a different standard than any of the other churches that they think are ruled by the devil because they go to church on Sunday, right? But if I go to one of those Sunday worshiping churches and I have a million questions for the pastor, they're going to sit there and talk to me about it. They're not going to be like, no, I'm not going
Right.
to
What
answer.
difference does it make?
Yeah.
Michelle, it sounds like you really loved your husband and you were like trying so hard, even though you didn't believe, you were doing what he asked of you and you were counseling with the pastor. It seemed like you were really trying to do all the right things, to make the marriage work
Yeah.
and,
Right.
but it didn't,
No. So I was miserable. I was there for him. I
right,
didn't want to be there. I didn't believe in this anymore.
right.
And, you know, I had already looked in the Bible a lot about what it said about marriage. And, I remember saying to Mark, like, marriage is a covenant also. So,
Mm-hmm.
why is this any less important than the covenant that you make with God? Like, the way that the Bible talks about marriage, like, this is not it. And you know how the verse says about like the non-believing spouses, that they're sanctified by the believing spouse. And I'm like, well, what about this? Like, how does that not apply here? Why do I have to go to the church for you to stay home? When that's not what it says in the Bible. And so he would, obviously couldn't answer me. But I tried to get him to see, like the hypocrisy, right? That the church says one thing, but they really mean something different. Um, and he just, I think the reason why it was hard for him was because, but even before the church, and I knew this about him when we were dating, he told me once that he was like very afraid of death, right? Like terrified of death. And so that made me sort of understand why this church had their hooks so deep into him, was because, if you believe in their doctrine and you're one of the 144,000 chosen ones, then you don't experience death. So that was, I think, what got him. And
Right.
so the fear that he had of death, I think, was what kept him there and kept him sort of believing whatever they told him and not really questioning, because he would sort of lose that. And then I think looking back, that's probably what he meant when he said that he felt lost, So, but I was trying to just get him to reason with me, and I even like had like an intervention with a cult expert, not Steve Hassan, Rick Ross, and you know, Mark sat there for 10 hours. It was a long, like, meeting with him, and he, at the end of it, seemed to admit that yes, they do seem to fit the definition of a cult. He did agree with that part, but he couldn't get over the Bible studies part, as much as we tried to talk about their behavior and comparing them to other
That
cults.
indoctrination is so deep, isn't it?
Yeah, I think for people who have like an emotional attachment to it, it's much more difficult for them to let go, you know? Um, but he didn't agree to continuing the intervention because it was supposed to be for 3 days. He refused to go back. So I remember on the car ride home, he was very upset with me for, kind of putting him through that. And I understood it, I knew it was going to be uncomfortable for him, obviously.
How does that work? Because in the movie that we watched, they like kidnap him and beat him up, and then they hide him in a room and they break the seal.
Yeah.
Like, let's go to counseling, and then you're like, surprise, you're at cult therapy instead.
Right, yeah. It,
Is
it
that
does
kind of
not
more?
go like that at all.
Yeah.
So, the cult expert, whoever that may be, like, they say who they are, and they, the person has to agree to sit there for the intervention, even just to talk. Like, no one's holding anybody down.
Yeah.
you know, like we drove down there together. And so,
It is like a last effort though, right? Like it was probably like you had no idea what else to do. You're like, I want to save my marriage. I'm trying to tell my husband all this information that I have. He
yeah,
wasn't listening, like what else could you do? Right.
yeah, I was like really desperate at that point.
Right.
And yeah, that was really like the last thing that I thought I could do. I'm like, well, if this doesn't work, I don't know what else to do. I was hopeful about it, but ultimately they really got him. So I remember on the way home in the car, I was just like, please don't tell them about today. I said, if you tell them about today, they're gonna separate us. They're gonna tell you to leave me. So he agreed not to tell them, but I think he eventually did later on. Um, and that's when things got really, really bad. Um, I went back to the church one more time for, another one of those services and a study, and then they didn't let me sit next to Mark this time. And I asked why, and they wouldn't give me, they're like, oh, we don't know where he is or whatever. It was very weird. And I later asked him, I was like, what was up with that? Like, why didn't they let me sit with you this time if they let me sit with you the last time? And he's like, well, they didn't want, like, they thought that it was better for me so I could concentrate on the service. And when they did let me sit next to him, and I asked him why they let me sit next to him, he told me that it was because they didn't want me infecting the other sisters with my doubts. So do you see how like they sort of like change things? Like I'm talking, this is one Saturday to the next Saturday. This is not like, And so um it was just very, very odd. I thought that was really weird because I'm like, they're all over the place. One day the rules are one thing, and the next day the rules are something different. It was just very, very weird. It made me really uncomfortable. But yeah, so after the failed intervention, things got even worse because he would now be spending almost all of his time at the church. I wouldn't see him. He'd go straight there from work. He worked like 9 to 5 type hours, and um, he'd come home maybe at midnight or later, and then he would stay up reading like the books from there and then get up again at 5 o'clock in the morning. So at this point, like I'm sleep deprived, he's sleep deprived because, I don't know how you guys are, but like I remember at the time I was so anxious about him coming home that I couldn't fall asleep. Then when he got home, I was anxious that he was still up and moving around downstairs. And then, if I finally did fall asleep, then his alarm would go off at 5 a.m. So it was just this constant cycle where I was just so sleep deprived and on edge at this point. It was pretty bad. And the arguments got worse because we weren't spending any time together. So fast forward now, it's our 1 year anniversary that no one knows about because it was the May date.
Oh my gosh. So you guys did this for a long time.
Yeah.
Wow.
The intervention, I believe, was in March, I want to say. No,
Wow. That's a long
February.
time to live like that.
Yeah,
Ugh.
January, February. I can't remember exactly when it happened. And so around that time, like I had started, like I met Tyler online. He had like a blog about, Catholicism. It was like an apologetics website. And I had actually found his site when I was looking for information about Constantine and the Sabbath. And so we'd been in touch, and I was telling him about how I left and all these things that were happening with my husband at the time. And he had uh, started the examining site, but hadn't really worked on it. Like he had taken some of the articles from like his apologetic site and sort of put them there. It was like a project that he had, on his list of things that he planned on doing. He was never a member, by the way, but they tried to recruit him in Virginia. So,
Okay. That's how
uh,
he was introduced.
yeah.
Okay.
So because my husband was never home at that point and I wasn't going to the church and I was upset about this church and the things that they were teaching and the lies that I thought they were telling, I started to write articles and publish them on the examining site. So that's how it all got started, right? So I think that the cult probably made a mistake by having Mark there all the time because it left me with nothing but time to work on the examining site.
Yeah.
Like that's all I was so upset and depressed. I didn't want to go anywhere, I didn't want to do anything. And um writing those articles was a huge part of the healing process for me. even for myself, having
Because you
been,
could write it out and see, like, I'm not crazy. This is crazy.
yeah.
Like this, the things that they're doing are the problem. It's not like I'm not like spiritually dying in NICU right now.
Yeah.
It's not
Right.
me. It's like these are actually when you write them out and read them out on paper, like that's not right. That's crazy.
Yeah. So I went through every study that they taught me and like basically took each one apart, like put together like why they were all wrong, why the interpretation was wrong, why they were taken out of context, etc. So I was sort of deprogramming myself at the time. Even though I didn't believe in it, I didn't want to have any doubts, right? So I went through every single one at a time, and then it just kind of grew into something bigger. But things sort of when things got really bad was in April. So yeah, I think the intervention was in the beginning of March or something like that. Um, Mark came home one day and was like, the pastor said you can't come back to the church anymore. This was right after Passover. I remember because during the Passover, I remember sort of running into the pastor in the hallway, and he gave me like this really dirty look.
Oh, did you go to Passover that year?
Oh, I had to go.
Oh,
Otherwise, Mark would have left. Yeah. So I
okay.
was
And that's
also,
2011, right? So this is
yep,
2011. Okay.
11. Yep. So I had to go to the Passover. So I went and I was super uncomfortable being there. Like I almost had an anxiety attack sitting there. I didn't sit next to Paul. I went and sat next to somebody else like that I didn't even know. Like I just couldn't. And of course, the beginning of it was something about mitochondrial DNA, which I knew about, and what they said was wrong. And so I'm already sitting there spazzing out about that. You know what I mean? I'm just like, come on. And so um I was just mentally just like it was torture for me to keep going there and having to sit through, and the Passover is a long ceremony, okay? It's like a big deal, and I don't know. So it
Yeah,
was
I
just,
would say like 3 to 4 hours probably. It's like
yeah,
the longest ceremony
yeah,
because you have to do
longest
foot
3 to 4
washing and all
hours
that.
of my
Yeah,
life.
yeah.
And because I did not want to be there. And so I remember seeing the pastor in the hallway, and he gave me like this really dirty look. And I remember like texting Mark, like, I need to talk to you, because I was literally like having like anxiety while I was there. And I met with him in the hallway, and I was like, I don't know what's going on, but I don't feel good. Like I started crying. I'm like, I saw the pastor in the hallway give me like this really dirty look. I don't know what, like I'm like, I just don't feel right being here. Like something feels wrong. And he was like, well, try to calm down, it should be over soon, whatever. So it was finally over, and we didn't go together, obviously. And so I left. And he ended up staying in the church that night, which upset me. I'm like, what? Like when he texted me and was like, I'm sleeping over here, I was like, this is ridiculous. That was like the first time that he hadn't come home. And like I was like really upset that night. I'm like, this is wrong. Like everything about this is just wrong. And um, so after that, our anniversary would have been May 9th, and it ended up falling on Mother's Day. So it was like this big problem it was a Sunday, obviously, for us to spend time together. Like I wanted to plan at least to go to dinner, like something, right? Because I had tried to plan a vacation and he absolutely refused. He's like, and this is when I found out about the real like 2012 thing. I was like, why can't we go on vacation? He's like, I can't be on a beach somewhere when Father's coming. I'm like, what? What are you talking about? He's like, well, Father's coming any day now. And when he comes, I can't be on a beach somewhere on vacation. And I'm like, whoa, whoa, whoa. I'm like, what do you mean he's coming soon? What are you talking about? And then he sort of tried to like avoid the conversation. He's like, well, I can't miss the Sabbath, or I can't miss the Tuesday. I was like, all right, so we'll go somewhere Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and you'll be back for both of them. And he absolutely refused. Like there was no way I could convince him. Couldn't even go to dinner. We spent the most of the day fighting. Like it was bad. So before the anniversary, he had come home. This was the week after the Passover, and said the pastor said you can't come back anymore. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Because at that point, I had done the like one service, another service, and then the Passover. Um, the pastor said that you've been talking bad about the church online, and I'm like, and he said something about a Facebook group and all this other stuff, and I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about. what do you mean the pastor said I'm saying negative things online? Because at that point, whatever I had said about the church online, I had said anonymously. So I'm like, how does the pastor know anything that I said? And so I ended up calling the pastor on his cell phone, and I'm like, what is going on? What do you mean? Like, what did you tell Mark? And what do you mean I can't go back to the church because it's something I'm like, well, what did I say? And he's like, well, you come to the church, we'll have a meeting here and we'll tell you everything and we can talk about it. I'm like, okay, what day do you want me to come and what time? So we set the meeting. Mark lied to me. He told me initially he wasn't going to be there because he had to do something with his mom. And of course, as soon as I get there, I see him at the church. I'm like, I thought you had something to do with your mom. He's like, he said something, I don't know what it was. And so he had told me that he's like, the pastor says that they have like your IP address. And I'm like, what? What are you talking? Like, how do they have my IP address? And I remember a couple of nights before that he had asked me to borrow my computer. And I guess they must have told him to go to there's a website you can go to, like, what is my IP address or something like that. And it'll tell you what your IP address is. And so he must have done that. And so knowing how websites work because of, the examining site and sort of learning the back end of that whole thing, I'm like, when people comment, we can see their IP addresses, we can see their emails, so I'm like wondering, well, how did they get my IP address? That's not something that you can just ask Facebook for example, right? Like, I knew it wasn't an easy piece of information to obtain from a website. And so like a lot of websites have privacy, like disclosures and stuff like that. And
Right. So like if I make a comment on a website, my IP address is not going to be on there.
But it's
Right.
not published, like it's not made public. So
Right.
I was very suspicious about how the pastor allegedly got my IP address. So, I recorded the meeting because I knew that something was really off, So I'm like, something's going down today. I don't know what it is, but this is weird. And so, it was a meeting. It was me, Mark, the pastor, Daniel Lee, and Raymond Gonzalez was in the room. You guys just did a podcast with him recently, and he kind of talked about this a little bit. So, I get there, and they want me to sign a non-disclosure agreement. And I sort of read through it, and I noticed that it says that I can't talk about the church with anybody except Mark. I'm like, okay, this is weird. And so I'm like, okay, well, I was told that you guys had some evidence about something I said online. So, show me whatever evidence you were talking about. And they wouldn't show me. They were like, well, once you sign this agreement, we'll show you everything. And I'm like, no, show me now. Like, I was not going to sign that agreement, At that point, I was mentally out. They, to me, were nobody. They were just, another cult that they were deceptively recruiting and now deceptively retaining people. And so I was just like, I wasn't going to admit what I said online because it was none of their business. At that point, I'm like, I have the right to anonymous speech. I don't have to tell you anything. So I was like, yeah, I don't know what you're talking about. But they read comments that I posted because I recognized them on a website that had been recently taken down, allegedly because they were being sued by the church. I later come to find out that this is the website that the church set up in order to find out who was talking about them, and that's how they got my email address and my IP address, and that's how they knew what comments were tied to me. And they used my so when you normally sign up for an account on a website, and Raymond explained this too, the passwords are encrypted. So like if you were to join the forum on the examining site or leave a comment and you signed up for an account, I don't see your password. I can reset your password if you lose it or something, but I can't see what it is. And from what I understand, they turned that off. Like they wrote programming in order to turn that part off so that they could see people's passwords. So, back then especially, like, most people use the same password for things. And so I had used the same password for another account on the Rick Ross website. So through trial and error, they sort of were able to get into other online accounts that I had using my email address and the password that I had used on the site that was set up by the church.
Is that allowed for them to be able to see a password? Is that legal?
Seeing the password is not necessarily illegal, right? But using that password to try to hack
Right.
into other accounts is
And
not sure. But I remember, I mean, the site was gone, so even if I wanted to check it at that point, I wasn't going to be able to. But I knew Rick Ross personally, obviously. So I knew that he wasn't going to give my personal information away to a group that he knew was a cult. Like, and I knew that Facebook wasn't about to just give over my information either, but that's what they claimed, that they got the information from the administrators of these websites. And also Facebook just also gave them my information because they asked for it. So I knew they were lying. You know what I mean? So I refused to sign the agreement. I was like, yeah, I'll have my lawyer look at it or whatever. But I did in that meeting tell them that they were causing problems between me and Mark. I did, want to put that out there. And they were like, oh, no, we're not trying to do that. They tried to like act like that wasn't their intention, but it 100% was. At this point, because I was writing on things online, they wanted Mark to leave me. That was my punishment, basically. So if I didn't agree to sign the non-disclosure agreement and stop writing about them online, it was made very clear during that meeting that they were going to make Mark leave me, because the pastor even said, if you're writing these things online about the church, how is Mark supposed to stay with you? Like, you're saying it to my face, like that, if I don't do what you tell me to do, he's going to leave me and you're going to be the reason why. So it was very clear to me at that point. I was very upset. And I remember talking to Mark about it after, but they had gotten him so upset about me, writing things online, that he wasn't really like listening to me at all. So the arguments just got more and more intense at that point. And like at that point, we'd done the intervention, it failed. We had this meeting with the pastor and he didn't, see through what was happening. And yeah, I ran out of options at that point. His family wasn't trying to help me either. Like the anniversary thing happened, he was still here. So that was April 22nd of 2011 that I had the meeting with the pastor in Raymond. And then May 9th would have been our anniversary, and we didn't do anything. And then things just got progressively worse from there. Like, it was just constant arguments. And he'd come home and be like, the pastor said, and I'm like, what do you mean the pastor said? Like, it was a conversation you and I had privately, so there was, at that point, we weren't sleeping in the same bed anymore. Like, he refused to be affectionate with me at all. He would barely even speak to me. So, the marriage was like essentially over at that point, even though we were still living in the same house. So a month later, we had a huge fight, and he ended up moving out for good. It was June 5th, and yeah, so I tried talking to him after that. I tried messaging him to get him to, come back. I thought maybe if he spent more time with them, he could kind of see how controlling they were or something. I don't know. I thought maybe, the novelty would sort of wear off a little bit. But no, they were able to really convince him that I was possessed by the devil and that I was threatening his chances of getting into heaven. And yeah, he, and then I remember in one of the messages, and I sent you guys the screenshots so you can use them, but he said something like, you talking about badly about the church online is only making things worse. And basically, it was very clear that that was the reason why, he didn't want to be in the marriage anymore, was because I had betrayed the church or betrayed God, right? Those things are the same thing there. So,
you guys, we also have the audio from the meeting that she's talking about. And so
with Raymond. So you can hear Raymond trying to persuade her to sign the NDA and trying to explain this evidence, quote unquote, that they have against her, but it's not there.
yeah.
And she's so smart because she's like, no, I'm not going to sign anything until you show me what kind of evidence you have. And they won't even let her walk away with the NDA. So it's really interesting.
Yeah.
And not interesting. It's really just so manipulative and
It's
sad.
infuriating, but you're also like, go, Michele.
Yeah,
Smart. The whole time I
for
was listening,
sure.
look, yeah, she's so smart. She's so smart that she even knows to like ask those questions.
Thank goodness.
I know.
Thank goodness. Yeah.
I was
Yeah, and
so proud of you. The whole time I heard that, I was like, yes. This is
well,
I
shit.
know, but it just sucks because I mean she lost her husband, it just makes me feel so sad. Like this is a case where it really broke up your relationship, somebody that you were with before the church,
Yeah.
before you even heard about the church, and now,
You have such a
all this
unique
stuff happened.
experience too, because most people are like in it and then they leave and they have to deal with that trauma. You were in it, you had to live with the trauma of leaving, and then also being on the other side and having somebody that you loved in it and not being able to get them out. I mean, you really are like a member and also a family member.
yeah,
It's like
Mhm.
you've had all of the experience from that church, so I'm sorry.
it was really, really, really difficult time. Like I went to counseling for 6 months after that to deal with it. You know, continuing to work on the examining site did help me also. Um, and it turned into something that was much bigger than me at that point. And it wasn't just about Mark at that point either, because, I had sort of accepted that he was gone and, the marriage was over. But now here I am, and what am I going to do about it? Right. So, um, people started to write to us on the examining site saying how the information helped them to leave, um, or family members that, found the information helpful in understanding what it was that their family members were involved in. And um, so, yeah, it became something much bigger. And that motivated me to write the 5-part story. And, I said, like, if I help one person to avoid like the pain and suffering that I'm going through now, like, it's totally worth it. Right. So I didn't put my name on anything that I wrote. My intention was never to be known for fighting this cause or like even having been in it. Um, yeah, like my point was just to put the story out there, like the ones that I had read that had kind of helped me to see what the church was really about. That were almost like they kept disappearing, these websites. It was very weird. So I wanted to put something out there that was more recent, that I sort of could control and, make sure that it didn't disappear.
And you knew it was accurate information. You knew they couldn't come and say, well, that's not true. So this whole website's fake. It's like, no, I know this is true because I've experienced it and I was there.
Right.
But your website helped more than one person. It helped. I mean, I remember reading it when Tony was in the church because it was the only resource on the internet
Yeah,
that like,
because before
yeah,
that, you couldn't have, like you said, you couldn't find anything, or you'd find like a random forum and then it would be gone.
Right.
It's very hard, or maybe it would be in Korean. But then
Right.
once you guys made that website, it was all condensed in one place. It's still to this day is the greatest resource that, the survivors have to go to find the information. So
Mhm.
as you were writing the articles, were you like shocked as you were learning more information about what was going on in the church? Were you surprised when you read people's comments?
Yeah, I mean, getting the emails really helped to remind me that it was, it was, it helped me to feel like I'm turning like this really horrible situation into something good if it helps other people, right? So even though it was part of the healing process for me to go through and write all those articles and put the information out there, it also did help a lot of people. Like we would get more and more messages all the time about it, and that kept us going. And once we started to research about like what the group was in Korea and how, their history sort of evolved and no one knew about it, and about An Sung-hong having kids, and then we found pictures of him and the kid. I mean, it just became something completely like nothing I imagined that it would. I thought that I would just write about their Bible studies not being, uh, doctrinally sound, I guess, for lack of a better way to put it. When most people joined, there was no alternate side of the story. Like they don't want current members speaking to former members, right? They don't want the members in the group to go on the internet because that's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That's how they control information. Yeah, so if you're in that group, it's like a vacuum, right? So you're in this bubble where you only hear information that they want you to hear. So having a resource for when people are looking for it for a different side of the story, to me was really important because, making an informed decision is important. So if you read all of the like things that I went through, that other people went through, and you still think that the Bible studies were correct or whatever, and you decided to stay there, and you knew that like your family members were not your family members anymore, and like if you had a relationship that was going to be over, like if the person didn't join, and you still wanted to be there, fine, right? Because at least then you're making an informed decision, like you've heard both sides. But I thought that it was very unfair that the members weren't allowed to hear the other side of the story, or if they did, it had to be filtered through the church first. So I just thought that that was unfair. So my purpose was to put, the alternative side of the story out there for people to read and sort of weigh on their own and make their own decisions. So, but yeah, it turned into something much bigger than I ever imagined it would be. And, it, because it was organized and getting people to leave, that motivated them to sue me.
Did you guys like actually go through a legal divorce like in June then, like that summer?
So he filed for divorce, I believe it was in July. The divorce was finalized in February of 2012.
Oh, okay. Wow. God, they take forever, huh?
Yeah, I
Like,
mean, because of the court process and everything.
yeah.
Yeah, and I
So
didn't necessarily want to be divorced. Like at that point, I still had some hope that maybe he would like come to his senses,
yeah.
But, I had to accept the fact that that wasn't going to happen. So, and then shortly after the divorce became final, I heard that, he was arranged and married to somebody else a few months later, which I expected would happen as well. So,
That's
you
so
know,
devastating though.
yeah, at that point, it really wasn't about him anymore.
Yeah, by February you're like, whatever, dude, I'm on a different mission.
Yeah, like it, and by that time they had already filed their first lawsuit against me. So they filed their first lawsuit in December 11th of 2011, I believe, was the filing date.
On our next episode, we're going to go into this because as we've heard before we introduced Michele, we've heard from other members what they were told while they were in the church about her and how she initiated this lawsuit against the church. And that's why they were like protecting themselves. And she was this like evil spirit to them. And so on our next episode, we're going to get into the details of what actually happened to Michele and about the lawsuits. So stay tuned for the next episode because we're about to blow everybody's mind who thought that they knew the story because they didn't. So thank you, Michele, so much, and we'll talk to you next time. And boom, baby.
Boom, baby.